The Senate will come to order, and the chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer. Dr. Black.
Let us pray. Father of life, awaken in our senators the joy of living this day with all its new challenges and hopes. May they see in the challenges opportunities to grow in grace and in a deeper knowledge of you. May they find in their hopes seeds to plant that will bring a harvest of healing to our land. Lord, fill their working hours with your redeeming radiance and their hearts with your peace. Keep them safe, for they have found in you a refuge. Instruct them with your truth as you give them faith to believe in the certainty of your ultimate triumph. We pray in your strong name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Morning business is closed. And under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Small Business Administration, Isabella Guzman of California to be Administrator.
Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. President, the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed just how important the federal government can be in helping workers, families, and businesses during a time of crisis. Congress has passed trillions of dollars in urgent relief, and we have relied on federal agencies to implement that aid quickly, reliably, competently. So while it might not normally be as high profile as other cabinet agencies, the Small Business Administration has recently been in the spotlight. Over the last 12 months, the Small Business Administration has overseen 2 pandemic-related programs that will dole out more than $1 trillion to our nation's small businesses, nonprofits, and religious institutions. Moving forward, it will play a prominent role in implementing the American Rescue Plan. And today, the Senate will vote on President Biden's nominee to take on that important job, Ms. Isabella Guzman. Ms. Guzman could not be more ready. She comes from a family of small business owners herself. Her dad ran his own veterinary clinic. Not only is Ms. Guzman a veteran of the Small Business Administration, serving as Deputy Chief of Staff in the Obama administration, she has just finished a stint as a top official at California's Office of Business and Economic Development, helping support the 5th largest economy in the world. For many Americans, opening and operating a business is in their own part of the American dream. I have every confidence that under Ms. Guzman's leadership, the SBA will help small business owners hold on to their dreams until our economy comes roaring back. This morning, I also want to continue the theme of highlighting aspects of the American Rescue Plan that have not received enough attention. We've heard a lot about the progress that we've made on vaccines. I read this morning that 109 million Americans have received at least 1 vaccination. So we are well on the path to getting Americans vaccinated. And checks have gone out the door. I was on a call with people from Central Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy, and Brownsville last night, and many had already received their checks. Very much needed, very much welcomed. As President Biden announced today on the vaccines, we've had 100 million shots in people's arms and 100 million checks in people's pockets. Let's say that again. That sounds good to me, Mr. President. 100 million shots in people's arms and 100 million checks in people's pockets. Democrats are delivering what we promised. Now, we've heard a lot about how the American Rescue Plan will help Americans who need it the most. The 20% of Americans at the lowest levels of income will receive the highest levels of support. It's about time. We had the mirror image of that when our Republican colleagues ran the Senate, where the top 1% did the best and the bottom 20% were totally ignored. That's backwards. God bless the people who are in the top 1%, but they don't need the help. It's the people struggling to feed their families, pay the rent, help the kids in school that need the help. And we're doing it. First time in a while. Experts predict that child poverty could be cut in half. Meanwhile, the top 1% of Americans will see an income boost of 0%. As I said, God bless them, but they're doing fine already. They're doing fine already. And we've heard a lot about how the American Rescue Plan will prime the American economy to come roaring back. Economists are already projecting that economic growth could double as a result of the American Rescue Plan. When over 75, 85, I think it is, % of Americans get some checks, the money goes out. It starts revitalizing our economy. People shop in the stores, eat at the restaurants, even begin to travel. See their relatives maybe for the first time if people are vaccinated. Wow, this is great news. This is great news. So, I think that America is turning the corner, and I think the attitude of Americans is turning the corner as well. People now see a brighter future for this country and their regions. So, today, though, as I said, there's so much in this bill, but every day I want to focus on something else that may not be focused upon. Since the Senate is set to vote on the confirmation of the new SBA Administrator, today's a good opportunity to expand on just how the American Rescue Plan will help our nation's 30 million small businesses. Now, we all know that small businesses have been some of the hardest hit entities by the pandemic. Early in the crisis, 80%, 4 out of 5 of small businesses reported having to close their doors at one point. Just the other day, I heard of a local New York business owner was forced to close up shop after surviving most of the pandemic. You could hear the pain in their voice. They poured their entire soul into this business. I know, this hits home for me. My dad was a small businessman. He struggled. He had a little exterminating business all through my growing years, from the day I was born till the day I left the house. My brother, sister, and I still have vivid memories, Mr. President, of Dad pacing the floors Sunday nights at 2 a.m. because he hated going to work Monday morning. So many challenges, so much thrown at him, and not much he could do about it. He was wondering how he would actually provide for his family. Now, praise God, he retired at around 70. He's now 97. He's been a happy man for these last 27 years. God is good, as you know, Mr. President, better than most of us. But he struggled. And so when I hear about the anguish of small business people, I'll never forget. I would work there sometimes, weekends, summers. And he sent me out to collect checks from a landlord who had 3 or 4 buildings, smaller buildings, and we had done the my dad's company had done the exterminating. The guy hadn't paid for 6 months. And I traveled, it took me about an hour and a half on 2 buses to go to this man's door. I knocked, he opened the door. I said, you know, I'm Chuck Schumer, the son of Abe Schumer, Century Exterminating. You owe us 6 months. We've been doing a good job exterminating your house. You know what he said to me? Your dad's a small businessman. He can't afford a lawyer. He can't afford anything to go after me. I'm not paying. The anguish that small business people face. So we need to help them. We need to help them. And that's one of the many reasons I'm so proud of the American Rescue Plan, because it provides tens of billions of dollars in support for small businesses that have suffered during the pandemic. The American Rescue Plan is nothing short of a lifeline for Main Street businesses from one end of this country to the other. Main Street businesses in rural America, Main Street businesses in suburban America, Main Street businesses in urban America and in our inner cities. It's a lifeline. For starters, the American Rescue Plan provides $30 billion for restaurants and bars through the Restaurants Act, which was the first bipartisan amendment added to the bill sponsored by Senators Sinema and Wicker. The American Rescue Plan also includes more than $1 billion in additional support for our nation's small theaters and venues, adding to a grant program I helped create in December called the Save Our Stages Act. These independent art venues, restaurants, art venues, and places like that are the hardest hit because that's where people, churches, that's where people gather. When they're not gathering, there's no income, whether it be the money they pay the small business, the check they pay at the restaurant, or the money they leave in the collection plate when they're not there in our religious institutions. So this is a good thing. And I want to say one more thing about Save Our Stages. It not only includes more money for Save Our Stages, it includes an amendment I authored to allow venue owners to apply for aid through Save Our Stages without losing eligibility for a traditional small business grant through the PPP. So that's a change that our arts institutions, our independent venues, our theaters should know. They can get both PPP and Save Our Stages. Now, these venues, the small businesses of many types, the nonprofits, they're the lifeblood of our communities. They were the first to close. They'll be the last to open. I'm hopeful that the support we passed in the American Rescue Plan will help our small businesses, our theaters, and our music venues, our restaurants, to hold on until we can all gather safely once again. That's not all. The American Rescue Plan provides $15 billion in flexible, targeted grants to help small businesses that have had a hard time accessing relief over the last 12 months, including most nonprofits and churches. Up to 90% of minority-owned small businesses will qualify for this funding, closing the racial gap and keeping local economies from deteriorating further. We invest $10 billion in state, local, and tribal small business financing programs. We expand the employee retention tax credit so that businesses of any size can more easily keep their workers on the payroll, because that one doesn't have an employee number limit. And finally, we bolstered and expanded the popular Paycheck Protection Program to include more nonprofits, including labor and agricultural organizations who, unfortunately, in December, our Republican colleagues wouldn't let in. In a nutshell, the American Rescue Plan provides a colossal boost for our nation's small businesses, and we'll make sure that all of them, not just those with the right connections, can access relief. It'll help millions of Americans keep their jobs, retain their income, support their families during this recovery. Now, we know many of these businesses are not out of the woods yet. There is still some time until our country can fully open up, until families can eat inside their favorite restaurant or colleagues can meet at a bar for a happy hour, until we can see one of our favorite performers put on a concert. But we're already seeing signs of hope. As a Washington Post headline announced recently, companies are scaling back layoffs because of the American Rescue Plan. Let me say that again, proudly and happily. Companies are scaling back layoffs because of the American Rescue Plan. And the Senate, I assure the American people, is going to keep working to make sure that the support for our businesses remains intact over the next few months. I yield the floor. And note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President,
The Republican leader is recognized.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, today I'd like to begin with a few quotations. Quote, "The legislative filibuster is the most important distinction between the Senate and the House. Without the 60-vote threshold for legislation, the Senate becomes a majoritarian institution, just like the House, much more subject to the winds of short-term electoral change. No senator would like to see that happen. So let's find a way to further protect the 60-vote rule for legislation." That was the that was the current Democratic leader, Senator Schumer, in April of 2017, less than 4 years ago. Here's another quote, Mr. President. "What about the nuclear option, doing away with the filibuster? I can tell you that would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised and created, going back to our founding fathers. We have to acknowledge our respect for the minority, and that is what the Senate tries to do in its composition and in its procedure," end quote. That was the Assistant Democratic leader, Senator Durbin, in 2018, about 3 years ago. A few years ago, 33 members of the Senate side signed a letter insisting that, quote, "we preserve existing rules, practices, and traditions regarding legislation." Now, under pressure from the outside, many of our Democratic colleagues are abandoning their stated principles as fast as possible. Yesterday, Senator Durbin said the filibuster is not a core principle, but, quote, "an offhanded clerical suggestion." An offhanded clerical suggestion. And a number of Senate Democrats are trying to pressure the senior senators from West Virginia and Arizona to abandon their own very recent commitments to honor this central rule of the Senate. Now, Mr. President, the framers designed the Senate to require deliberation, to force cooperation, and to ensure that federal laws in our big, diverse country earn broad enough buy-in to receive the lasting consent of the governed. James Madison said the Senate should be a complicated check against improper acts of legislation. Thomas Jefferson said great innovation should not be forced on slender majorities. Senate Democrats parroted all these arguments when they were the ones benefiting from minority protection. When President Trump pressed Republicans to kill the filibuster, our Democrat colleagues cried foul. And when our Republican majority stood on principle and refused to wreck the rules, our Democratic colleagues happily used the filibuster themselves. In some cases, they flat out blocked legislation, like Senator Tim Scott's police reform bill. In many other cases, Democrats did what minority parties always do, and leveraged the existence of the filibuster to influence must-pass legislation long before it got to the floor. There's so much emphasis on the most extreme bills that either party might pass with a simple majority. People forget that the Senate's 60-vote threshold is the only reason that any routine must-pass legislation is bipartisan, except during divided government. Big funding deals, appropriation bills, farm bills, highway bills, the NDAA. The Senate's 60-vote threshold backstops all of it. It's not just about controversial items, it's about everything we do. The Senate Democrats who are pressuring our colleagues from Arizona and West Virginia to reverse themselves are not just arguing for some procedural tweak, not a procedural tweak. They're arguing for a radically less stable and less consensus-driven system of government. Forget about enduring laws with broad support. Nothing in federal law would ever be settled. Does anyone really believe the American people were voting for an entirely new system of government by electing Joe Biden to the White House and a 50-50 Senate? This is a 50-50 Senate. There was no mandate to completely transform America by the American people on November 3rd. That may be what a few liberal activists want, but does anyone believe that millions of Americans thought that's what they were electing? Of course not. There's an ironic element to this whole conversation. Some Democratic senators seem to imagine this would be a tidy trade-off. If they could just break the rules on a razor-thin majority, sure, it might damage the institution, but then nothing would stand between them and their entire agenda, a new era of fast-track policymaking. But, Mr. President, anyone who really knows the Senate knows that's not what would happen. So let me say this very clearly for all 99 of my colleagues. Nobody serving in this chamber can even begin to imagine what a completely scorched earth Senate would look like. None of us have served 1 minute in a Senate that was completely drained of comedy and consent. This is an institution that requires unanimous consent to turn the lights on before noon, to proceed with a garden variety floor speech, to dispense with the reading of lengthy legislative text, to schedule committee business, to move even non-controversial nominees at anything besides a snail's pace. So, Mr. President, I want our colleagues to imagine a world where every single task, every one of them, requires a physical quorum, which, by the way, the Vice President does not count in determining a quorum. Everything that Democrat Senates did to Presidents Bush and Trump, everything the Republican Senate did to President Obama, would be child's play compared to the disaster that Democrats would create for their own priorities if they break the Senate. So this is not a trade-off between trampling etiquette, but then getting to quickly transform the country. That's a false choice. Even the most basic aspects of our colleagues' agenda, the most mundane task of the Biden presidency, would actually be harder, not easier, for Democrats in a post-nuclear Senate that is 50-50, dead even. If the Democrats break the rules to kill Rule 22 on a 50-50 basis, then we will use every other rule to make tens of millions of Americans' voices heard. Perhaps the majority would come after the other rules next. Perhaps Rule 22 would just be the first domino of many, until the Senate ceased to be distinct from the House in any respect. This chaos would not open up an express lane to liberal change. It would not open up an express lane for the Biden presidency to speed into the history books. The Senate would be more like a 100-car pileup, nothing moving. And then there's the small matter that majorities are actually never permanent. The last time a Democratic leader was trying to start a nuclear exchange, I remember offering a warning. I said my colleagues would regret it a lot sooner than they thought. And just a few years and a few Supreme Court vacancies later, many of our Democratic colleagues said publicly that they did. Touching the hot stove again would yield the same result, but even more dramatic. As soon as Republicans wound up back in the saddle, we wouldn't just erase every liberal change that hurt the country. We'd strengthen America with all kinds of conservative policies with zero input from the other side. How about this? Nationwide right to work for working Americans. Defunding Planned Parenthood in sanctuary cities on day one. A whole new era of domestic energy production, sweeping new protections for conscience and the right to life of the unborn. Concealed carry reciprocity in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. Massive hardening of security on our southern border. We saw during amendment votes just days ago that some common sense Republican positions actually enjoy more support right now than some of the Democratic committee chairs' priorities. And this is with them in the majority. So the pendulum, Mr. President, would swing both ways, and it would swing hard. My colleagues and I have refused to kill the Senate for instant gratification. In 2017 and 2018, I was lobbied to do exactly what Democrats want to do now. A sitting president leaned on me to do it. He tweeted about it. What did I do, Mr. President? I said to the president at that time, no. I said no repeatedly, because becoming a U.S. Senator comes with higher duties than steamrolling any obstacle to short-term power. I meant it. Republicans meant it. Less than 2 months ago, two of our Democratic colleagues said they mean it too. If they keep their word, we have a bipartisan majority that can put principle first and keep the Senate safe. I suggest you have the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
The majority whip is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, last week I introduced a bill to permanently repeal the death tax. I've been pushing to repeal the death tax for a long time because I've seen the consequences the tax can have for family farms and ranches and for family businesses. And I'm proud that we protected a lot of family farms and businesses 3 years ago with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act by doubling the death tax exemption. But the death tax is still a big problem. First of all, the change we made to the death tax in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act isn't permanent. The increased exemption level expires at the end of 2025. Second, Democrats, always eager to seize any possible revenue source, have proposed not merely returning the exemption to its previous level, but reducing it even further. And that would be a big problem for a lot of family farms and businesses. Mr. President, the death tax is a fundamentally flawed idea, both in theory and in practice. Every American, of course, has an obligation to pay taxes to help support our government. But there should be a limit to how many times the government can tax you. And death should not be a taxable event. The money you leave at your death has already been taxed by the government at least once, which makes the death tax double taxation. Mr. President, people who support the death tax tend to talk as if the death tax only affects the fabulously wealthy. But that isn't the case. Small and medium-sized businesses, family farms, and ranches spend a lot of time and money on estate planning to avoid being hit by this tax. Farmers and ranchers in my state know that without careful and costly planning, the federal government can come around after their death demanding a staggering 40% of their taxable estate, and their children won't have the money to pay without risking the farm or the ranch. Why? Well, farming and ranching is often a cash-poor business. A farmer might technically be worth several $1 million, but the vast majority of that is land and farming equipment. Only a small fraction of it is money in the bank. The Farm Bureau reports that over the past 10 years, the value of farmland has increased by nearly 50%. It's completely possible that a farmer's land might have substantially increased in value over the past decade, while his income has barely increased at all. Or with commodity prices the past few years, he may have been losing money. In fact, it's perfectly possible that in a bad year, a farmer with several $1 million worth of land might barely break even income-wise. So what happens when a farmer dies? Well, the federal government will claim up to 40% of his taxable estate. But his liquid assets, in other words, the cash he has available, will likely not come close to covering the tax bill from the federal government. And so the only thing left for his children to do will be to start selling off farm equipment and land. In some cases, they will be able to keep the farm, just a smaller version of it. In others, they may have to sell off the family farm entirely. The same thing can happen with family-owned businesses. In the case of a larger family-owned business, the business owner may be worth $15 or $20 million, but only a small fraction of that may be money in the bank. The vast majority may be tied up in the business. In that case, when the federal government comes around demanding 40% of the taxable estate, all the money that that business owner had in the bank won't even come close to covering the tax bill. To pay the federal government, the owner's descendants will have to sell off part or all of the family business. And this can happen again and again. Think about a business that was started half a century ago and passed down from father to daughter to grandson. With every death, the federal government will have come demanding a big chunk of that estate. By the time you get to the third generation, the business may be struggling to stay afloat, if it's still around at all. I recently read testimony from a business owner who stated that without death tax reform, the family company will end with him. Why? Because the company will have to be sold to meet the tax bill the federal government will hand his descendants. The company's already faced the death tax multiple times in its history and given millions upon millions to the federal government. This next death tax bill will be the death blow. Mr. President, I'm proud that Republicans improved the death tax situation for a lot of family farms and businesses by passing estate tax reform in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But doubling the exemption is not enough. There are still family farms and businesses out there that aren't protected from this tax. And in my view, losing even one family farm or ranch or business to the death tax is one too many. Not to mention the fact that in less than 5 years, the expanded exemption will expire, putting many farms and businesses back in the tax's crosshairs. Family farms and businesses play a vital role in the economy and in communities. Family farms and ranches are the lifeblood, literally, of rural communities in South Dakota. They're a source of jobs. They provide support for local businesses. They help build up local schools and local infrastructure. Losing a local farm can hit rural communities very hard. Mr. President, it's mind-boggling that the federal government imposes a tax that punishes all the things we should be encouraging. The death tax punishes hard work. It punishes success. It punishes innovation. Success should not be a dirty word. And families and employees should not be punished because a family has worked hard and built up a successful farm or ranch or business. On top of all this, the death tax is an inefficient tax that raises a small amount of revenue while placing a very large burden on farmers and ranchers and small businessmen and women. Mr. President, repealing the death tax is an idea that has won bipartisan support in the past, including support from more than one sitting Democrat senator. I hope it will win bipartisan support in this Congress as well. And I will continue to fight to ensure that no family, farm, or business has to worry about this punishing tax. I said it before and I'll say it again. One family, farm, or business lost is one too many. Mr. President, I yield the floor and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Majority Whip.
Mr. President, I ask the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
And I ask to speak as if in morning business.
Also without objection.
Mr. President, it's flattering when the Republican Senate leader comes to the floor and mentions your name. And Senator McConnell did just that this morning. The issue was the filibuster. And Senator McConnell found a quote of several years ago where I spoke in favor of the filibuster to protect minority rights in the Senate. It's true. I did say that. And it was based on life experience, having already served in the Senate for a number of years. I came to understand how it evolved as one of the procedures of the Senate. But I'll have to say to you that my impression of the filibuster changed. And the reason it changed was none other than the Republican Senate Majority Leader, now Minority Leader, Senator McConnell. You see, the filibuster really was created in the Senate through its own rules, as I explained yesterday. And it came to define the Senate in this respect. The Founding Fathers looked to the Senate to provide 2 representatives, and literally senators, from each state, regardless of population. So smaller states, back in the original colonies, smaller states like Delaware would have the same number of senators as a large state like Virginia. And that was their intention. So the protection of minority rights was kind of built into the definition of the United States Senate. And the filibuster became its manifestation in the procedure, the daily procedure of the Senate. And under that filibuster, of course, one senator could stop the debate or at least slow it down by insisting on a filibuster, only to be stopped by an extraordinary majority of the Senate voting to return to the regular business. That was the case in 1957, because in August of 1957, Senator Strom Thurmond took to the floor of this United States Senate and initiated the longest filibuster in its history, 24 hours and 18 minutes. The man stood by his desk and spoke without stopping. He didn't have any permission to leave the floor for any reason, and certainly couldn't sit down without losing his filibuster. He did it. He did it for the wrong reason, I'm afraid, because he was trying to stop the march of civil rights in this country. But he did it, determined he achieved that goal. And when he did, in 1957, that was the 5th filibuster in the history of the Senate in the previous 5 decades. In other words, if you went back to 1919, all the way to 1957, Strom Thurmond's was the 5th filibuster in history. Once every decade, a filibuster emerged on the Senate floor. Well, that world has changed, dramatically changed. We can now have 5 filibusters in a couple weeks. We now have, on average, 80 filibusters a year because of the urging and direction of the senator from Kentucky, Senator McConnell. He has institutionalized the filibuster to the point where it is now the normal course of business, not an extraordinary procedure. I recounted the fact that I introduced the DREAM Act 20 years ago. 20 years ago. Durbin, what kind of a senator are you that in 20 years you can't pass the DREAM Act? Well, I brought it to the Senate floor on 5 different occasions, and on 5 different occasions it was stopped by the filibuster. Other members can tell the story of their legislative experience on the floor too. The point I'm getting to is this. It wasn't until Senator McConnell and the Republicans who follow him decided to make the filibuster just daily business in the Senate that it was abused to the point where the Senate stopped doing regular legislative business. I'd like Senator McConnell to come to the floor the next opportunity he has and explain this to me. In the last calendar year, 2020, the Senate considered 29 amendments on the floor of the Senate in the entire year. Now, that doesn't count votorama, which is an aberration that I don't think would ever be accused of being deliberative. But 29 regular order amendments during the course of a year. Embarrassing, isn't it? When you think of this great so-called debating society, 29 times we brought an amendment to the floor. Well, it was an improvement over the previous year, 30% improvement, in fact, because in the year 2019, under Senator McConnell's leadership, we had 22 amendments. So when Senator McConnell and others come to the floor and plead for us to hang on to the traditions of the Senate, I would tell you that their interpretation of the traditions is strangling this body. They have beaten the old filibuster to the point where it is hardly recognizable and is now regular order of business in the United States Senate. And that's why many of us, frustrated with having worked so hard to come here, wanting to do the best we can to represent the people who've sent us here, are so frustrated by the current state of procedure. And for Senator McConnell and other Republicans to come to the floor and plead for hanging on to this tradition is actually pleading for the Senate to continue to do less and less each year. There are those of us now in control on the majority side, bare majority side, on the Democratic side, who really believe there's much more to be done in the Senate. The American people expect us to respond. Now, you might ask, well, how did you pass the American Rescue Plan if there's a filibuster used so frequently? It was under a process called reconciliation, which depends on a majority vote. You can't filibuster under the reconciliation. That's why this amazing bill, this new law, the American Rescue Plan by President Biden, is so sweeping in its reach. We had to try to combine under this law so many provisions that have been affected by the pandemic and the state of the economy, because we knew that returning to the regular order of business with the filibuster looming every single day would tie our hands just as sure as we've seen in the past several years. So, Senator McConnell, thank you for mentioning my name, but if I became skeptical of the filibuster, it's because of your use of it. And I hope that you understand that you can't have it both ways. It can't be a rare procedure and be a procedure that dominates the actual business of the Senate, as this has done for so many years. Mr. President, I ask that my following remarks be placed in a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
Last year, I came to the floor on multiple occasions to ask consent for a simple, sensible resolution. It called for the United States to cooperate in global efforts to address the COVID pandemic. At the time, that point was obvious, and it's even more obvious today. Pandemics don't respect borders. None of us are safe from highly infectious diseases until all of us are safe. That's especially important to keep in mind as we begin to turn a corner here in America. Last week, during his first address to the nation, President Biden announced that all adults in America over the age of 18 will be eligible for vaccinations on May 1st of this year. If all goes to plan, we can look forward, as President Biden mentioned, to a 4th of July with family and close friends at a close distance. Considering what they inherited, the Biden administration deserves credit for dramatically scaling up vaccinations in America. The administration helped to strike an historic partnership between rival drug makers, ramped up manufacturers of vaccine, and improved coordination with state officials everywhere. We're seeing the world of difference that this makes. When you put competent, qualified leadership in charge in the White House and in state capitals, good things happen. Our weekly vaccine shipments in Illinois have nearly doubled. The federal government has erected a mass vaccination site at the United Center in Chicago, and it's also supported partnerships with community health centers and retail pharmacies to expand access to vaccines. A cautious hopefulness is washing over America, but we can't lose momentum in our fight against COVID. To put this pandemic really behind us and to bury it in history, we need to lend a hand to the many poor nations that have yet to receive a single dose of vaccine. The inequities are stark. 10 countries have accounted for 75% of total vaccinations administered worldwide, while approximately 100 countries have yet to administer any vaccine dosage. This dangerous shortfall has the potential to undermine the good work that's happening here in America. Closing this gap is not only the right and moral thing to do, it's the safest and smartest things to do to stop the threat COVID and its increasingly contagious variants pose to us all. Remember back a little over a year ago, an obscure city in China generated a virus, we think they did, that ended up circling the world many times over and changing life on this planet. Last month, I received a briefing from Dr. Fauci on the new genetic mutations of COVID-19. He shared troubling news about variants that are emerging in the United Kingdom, South Africa, and Brazil. Some of them may have more resistance to our current vaccines than we care to see. He warned that if we fail to stamp out the virus globally, then we will continue to see risks within our own borders. Variants of the virus could counteract the tremendous progress we've made and the progress that we're poised to make in the near future. As I said at the outset, viruses don't recognize borders. Crushing the virus in other countries is a strategic investment in our own national safety and security. President Biden understands this. He's serious about addressing the virus first in America and then around the world. He has set us on a pace to vaccinate all eligible Americans over the course of next several months. And let me urge those who are hesitant or skeptical as to whether it's the right thing to do it, please, for yourself, for those you love, and for this nation. President Biden wisely halted President Trump's withdrawal from the World Health Organization. He joined the global COVAX vaccine effort, and he allocated significant funding toward global vaccination efforts, funding that is expanded under the American Rescue Plan, which we passed just a few weeks ago here in the Senate. Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen recently announced that the United States will support the issuance of special drawing rights, a type of IMF foreign exchange reserve that can help poor countries buy vaccines and weather the economic fallout from the pandemic. A welcome move that I encouraged and was a co-author of with Senator Sanders and Congressman Chuy Garcia. Just last week, the President announced a partnership with key allies in the Pacific region to provide at least 1 billion COVID vaccines to countries in Asia. This is prescient global leadership, long overdue. The President's actions will save lives here at home and abroad, and these investments will fuel a global economic recovery, which we all want to see. To understand why a global strategy is called for, look at history. Some of you who are witnessing this statement on the floor at home may be old enough to have a distinct circular scar on your upper arm. Maybe you've seen it on the arms of a parent or grandparent. That mark is a relic from one of the world's greatest public health victories, the eradication of the deadly smallpox virus. The fact that so few people living today remember the death and misery caused by that disease is a testament to global public health strategy that stopped it. Smallpox was one of the most devastating diseases to afflict mankind. It is estimated to have killed up to 300 million people in the 20th century, 500 million people in the last 100 years. In 1967, the World Health Organization launched an historic international effort to eradicate it. It was one of the most successful public health initiatives in human history. Next month marks the 41st anniversary of that historic achievement. In the years since, America has led similar global efforts to stamp out diseases like polio and Ebola. If we follow in these footsteps, historians will one day add COVID to the top of that list of historic achievements. Pursuing a global strategy is the most effective way, maybe the only way, to accelerate vaccine production and distribution in every corner of the world. By sharing our wealth of knowledge and resources with the world, we reap life-saving benefits, not just around the world, but right here at home. We all know public health is bigger than partisanship and always has been. In the 2000s, for example, I called on then President Bush to help stem the scourge of AIDS around the world through the historic PEPFAR program. At the time, many of my Republican friends in the Senate supported it. I hope and expect that they'll do the same when it comes to addressing the global effort against COVID-19. The moment calls for nothing less. Public health experts understand that President Biden understands. I know we here in Congress understand that we can end the threat of COVID once and for all. it's within our power. I ask consent, Mr. President, that the next statement I make be put in a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, let me start this statement by saying I'm a fan of the U.S. Postal Service. I have been throughout my life. I believe the men and women who make the Postal Service work do a great service to this country and distinguish us from many countries in the world which don't have anything near our service or reliability in delivering the mail. Having said that, and believe it to my inner being, the Postal Service needs to take a hard look at what's going on within their ranks today. Last month, the U.S. Postal Service Great Lakes area sent out a postal equivalent of an SOS. It put out a call to mail carriers in 5 surrounding states asking for letter carriers to come to my state of Illinois and help deliver a huge backlog of undelivered packages and envelopes. It pleaded for mail carriers in the 5 collar counties surrounding Chicago to help deliver Chicago's mail on Sundays. Ken LeBay is one of the mail carriers who answered that call for help. Mr. LeBay has been a mail carrier in suburban Mount Prospect, Illinois, just outside Chicago for 28 years. He's a president of the local Letter Carriers Union. He's also quite an athlete. In 2002, he was the only mail carrier on the USPS-sponsored professional cycling team. He volunteered for the last Sunday in February. He figured he had the knowledge and endurance to help reduce the mail backlog that had plagued the Postal Service in Chicago. What he discovered, he said, stunned him. At every home he delivered to, he stuffed 20 to 30 pieces of mail in the mailbox. He worked 12 hours on that Sunday from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., sun up to sundown, without a break even for lunch. Still, he couldn't complete the assigned workload. The sheer volume of backlog mail was too great. Inside the local post office, Ken said, he found packages stacked everywhere. Some appeared to have been there for a month or more. The entire situation looked, in his words, like an episode of Extreme Hoarders, a crisis. Chicagoland is not the only postal chaos location, Mr. President. Nearly 9 months after a new Postmaster General unveiled his surprise reorganization plan, Postal Service in much of the nation is erratic. Mail delays are the longest they've been in generations. According to the Postal Service's own numbers, the agency's delivery times have shrunk to historic lows since the new Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, took over last June. At the end of December, the agency had an on-time rate of 38% for non-local mail. What was it 1 year earlier? 92%. 92% on-time rate descended to 38% under Postmaster General DeJoy. Before Louis DeJoy took over, 91% of Postal Service customers gave USPS high marks, one of the highest approval ratings of any government agency. Today, postal customers across America, certainly in my state of Illinois, wait anxiously for important checks and bills that arrive weeks late, if at all. They check tracking websites to search for delayed packages, only to read that the package is, quote, out for delivery. In some neighborhoods in Chicago, residents have given up hope of receiving mail at home. They stand in line for hours at the local post office to try to retrieve their mail themselves. Often, even that doesn't work. Tracy Otis is one of those people. One day last month, she was one of 40 customers, 40, waiting in line at the Postal Service station in the Gresham neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. Miss Otis hadn't had regular mail delivery since Christmas. She waited in line for hours, hoping to retrieve a package of diabetic test strips before her current supply ran out. She told a Chicago Sun-Times reporter that she would volunteer to sort the mail if it would help. She went home empty-handed that day, still not sure where her package was or when, if ever, she might see it. Last month, my staff in Chicago estimated that there might be 300 pieces of mail sitting undelivered in 4 Chicago postal facilities. We based that estimate on the number of complaints we'd received in our office. Soon after that, the Postal Inspector General released a report that showed we were wrong. There weren't 300 letters in postal limbo in these facilities. There were 19,000 undelivered pieces of mail in those 4 facilities. Since then, in my state, the chaos has stretched way beyond Chicago. We hear from all over the state: Springfield, Champaign-Urbana, Belleville, East St. Louis, Quincy, Peoria, the Quad Cities, and Rockford. These days in Illinois and across America, we're seeing real hardship for tens of millions of Americans waiting for mail delivery. Patients and pharmacists complain about late medication. People are getting dinged for late mortgage and utility payments and forced to pay late fees. Insurance policies are being canceled because of late payments. Small business owners are forced to wait weeks or months for payments. Others are flooded with calls and emails from customers wondering where their packages are, a good way to lose business. Who is Louis DeJoy, the mastermind of this mess? Did he come through the ranks of the Postal Service like 4 postmaster generals before him? No. His qualifications? He's a former logistics executive who donated millions of dollars to Donald Trump and the Republicans. No experience working at the Postal Service before Donald Trump tapped him to head this agency last June. 1 month later, in the middle of a pandemic that turned postal deliveries into a lifeline for many, Mr. DeJoy unveiled a radical plan to reorganize the Postal Service after only 1 month in the job and no experience in the department. He slashed overtime hours, prohibited late and extra mail delivery trips, and set stricter delivery schedules. In August, with no public explanation, the Postal Service began removing mail sorting machines from postal facilities around the country, reducing their ability to process mail. Amazingly, the Postal Service Inspector General determined that the changes were ordered with no analysis and no understanding of how they might affect the timeliness of mail delivery. A federal lawsuit forced the agency to put the changes on hold until after the election. On February 6, Mr. DeJoy was quoted in the Washington Post saying that his new plan for reorganizing the Postal Service would be ready for public release, quote, as early as next week. He said that on February 6. We're still waiting for it. Waiting for the DeJoy plan to shape up the Postal Service. It's like waiting for a lost package. We know some of the biggest changes Mr. DeJoy intends to propose because he's confirmed them publicly. The DeJoy plan for shaping up the post office is expected to call for the following: service cuts, higher prices, and slower mail delivery. If that sounds like a winning combination to you, I have some vintage computers to sell to your business. In short, this is not a solution. This is a sabotage of essential public service, and we shouldn't tolerate it. Well, America has a new president who understands that affordable, efficient postal service is essential to America. 5 days after taking office, President Biden replaced the chair of the Postal Regulatory Commission. Late last month, he filled 3 vacancies on the Postal Service Board of Governors, the body that hires the Postmaster General and oversees the Postal Service. I encourage President Biden to make all the changes necessary to rescue the Postal Service. Mr. DeJoy has offered a stream of excuses for the chaos that has fallen the Postal Service since he showed up. He says it's the pandemic, the Christmas holidays, bad weather, racial justice protests, an election. He's got a list as long as your arm. I would remind him that in 1864, we held a national election in the middle of a civil war, and 150,000 Union Army troops voted absentee from the field. The Postal Service is as old as America itself. It has proven that it can adapt to crises with the right leadership. If Mr. DeJoy cannot or will not provide that leadership, I respectfully suggest he step down. I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President,
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, today I rise in support of Isabella Guzman, currently the director of the presiding officers in California, Office of the Small Business Advocate, to be the administrator of the U.S. Small Business Administration. We all know the importance of small businesses and how they have been hit so hard during this pandemic. Small businesses employ nearly half of all private sector workers and make outsized contributions to the innovation that makes America's economy strong. Yet, the coronavirus has put millions of people out of business, hundreds of thousands of these mom-and-pop brick-and-mortar retail shops out of business, restaurants out of business, and we are so pleased that there is, as we say in Minnesota, a lighthouse that we're looking to now. I was up in Duluth on Sunday, and instead of the light at the end of the tunnel, which so many of us talk about with the end of this pandemic, the mayor there referred to it as a lighthouse. They've got a lot of lighthouses on Lake Superior, Mr. President. And the end of this pandemic is our lighthouse. And we see the blinking lights from a distance, but we know we are not there yet. And to get there, we not only need to get this vaccine to every person, and the President has said we will have available vaccines by the end of May for every adult in America. We have to get it distributed, and our pandemic bill certainly is going to be a major step toward getting that done. But we also need to get our business economy back in order. We need to be able to not be so far down in the ground that we can't climb out of where we are. And that's why having Ms. Guzman, who served as Deputy Chief of Staff and as the Senior Advisor at the Small Business Administration during the Obama administration, having someone with her record and her ability to lead in place is so important. She will oversee the Paycheck Protection Program, which we established on a bipartisan basis in March of 2020 as part of the CARES Act. She understands the need for greater equity in loan distribution and has shown commitment to transparency and accurate loan data. She has made clear that she will make the Paycheck Protection Program more accessible to businesses that have traditionally not had the access to banking relationships needed to secure loans and grants. And very significantly to me, and to those of us that worked on the Save Our Stages bill, including Senator Cornyn of Texas, who led the bill with me, she has made clear that she will move on the grant program immediately. We have been working with the staff there, and we have made some, given these venues who have been shuttered, the first to close, the last to reopen, the ability to access PPP loans, which is really important right now. But we also want to get the grant program out immediately, get that money out, distributing over $16 billion in grants. Our venues can't wait. They need that relief, and Ms. Guzman will be key to leading our way out of this and helping Senator Schumer with his theaters in New York to the Fargo Theater in North Dakota. We need to get this done. Restaurant relief. We just passed as part of the American Rescue Plan major bill, the $28.6 billion Restaurant Revitalization Fund, which is going to be so key. When I was at the Block Food and Drink restaurant in St. Louis Park on Sunday and then headed up Duluth to the Boat Club, with the mayor and the owners of the boat club, the stories I heard of servers who've been laid off, then came back, laid off, then came back, the stories I've heard about the owners of some of these restaurants taking out repeated loans, they are hanging in there, and we need to have their backs. 1 out of 6 restaurants in this country has permanently closed down during the pandemic. We don't want to just go, as the leader of the antitrust subcommittee in the Senate, we don't want to just give all of our food service and action in the restaurant area to the big guys. We're pleased we have successful restaurant chains in this country, but that can't be the only thing we have. And that's why helping these smaller venues is so important, and Ms. Guzman gets that. She is a lifelong proponent of small businesses, the daughter of a small business owner, and as a former entrepreneur, this makes her the right person for this job at the pivotal time in the life of our country. She has the backing of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and numerous trade organizations. I know her leadership at the SBA will put our struggling businesses in the best hand. With that, Mr. President, I ask my colleagues to support the nomination of Isabella Guzman to be Administrator of the Small Business Administration. You must be proud, Mr. President, as having someone who has done such good work in California in this job. We're excited about her and what she can do. And I also will put a remarks on the record as I'm running out of time. I see my colleague from Wisconsin is here. And we're going to have the vote ahead of us. Put my statement on the record for Javier Becerra. We're very excited about him as well to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Without objection.
I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
President,
Berlin.
I would ask consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I would ask consent that I be permitted to finish my remarks before the vote.
Also without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to voice my strong support for Isabella Guzman's nomination to serve as Administrator of the Small Business Administration. Our nation passed the one-year mark of COVID-19 being declared a national emergency last Saturday, March 13th. And thankfully, the American people can now see the light at the end of the tunnel. Already, more than 20% of all Americans have received at least one COVID-19 vaccine dose, with an average of more than 2.39 million additional doses being administered each day. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but we are not there yet. The COVID-19 pandemic has decimated American small businesses. The worst effects have been felt by the most vulnerable small businesses, especially those in Black, Latino, Native, and rural communities. So SBA must continue to be a lifeline in the coming months. That's why it's important that we confirm Ms. Guzman's nomination so she can provide the permanent, steady leadership SBA needs right now. When we passed the CARES Act, Congress tasked SBA with one of the most important aspects of COVID-19 relief effort. We knew we had to support our small businesses because the public health restrictions on public gatherings, which have saved thousands of lives and kept our communities safe, have been especially challenging for small businesses. We had to help small businesses so that we can get out of this pandemic. When our economy returns, our small businesses emerge in a position to help our economy recover and continue to grow. The CARES Act included $377 billion in funds for small businesses and created the Paycheck Protection Program, the EIDL Advance Program, and the Small Business Debt Relief Program to help small businesses that had traditional SBA loans like 7A and 504. Then in April, we passed legislation to replenish the PPP and EIDL Advance Grant Program with $370 billion in additional funds. And in December, we passed the Bipartisan Economic Aid Act to provide another $325 billion to support small businesses, allow for a second round of PPP loans, and created the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant Program. Mr. President, in total last year, Congress appropriated more than $1 trillion to the SBA for COVID-19 relief programs. Since the passage of the CARES Act, SBA has approved more than 7.5 million PPP loans worth more than $687 billion and more than $3.7 billion EIDL loans worth more than $200 billion. These loans and grants have saved millions of jobs and prevented millions of small businesses from closing their doors. I want to thank the SBA personnel who have worked long hours, including nights and weekends, to implement these critical programs. SBA still has a lot of work left to do. As I mentioned, the December bill created the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant Program, which we expect the SBA to open in the coming weeks. SBA has also opened a new SBA also has to open a new $28.6 billion grant program for restaurant and bars, which was created by the Historic American Rescue Plan. The plan appropriated an additional $50 billion in economic relief for small businesses, including $15 billion to targeted EIDL advance grants, and an additional $7.25 billion to PPP, and $1.25 billion for shuttered venue grants. The plan also required SBA to launch a Community Navigator pilot program, which is designed to help small businesses in underserved and underbanked communities access to COVID-19 relief resources available to them. These programs will be key to our economic recovery. That brings me to Mrs. Guzman's nomination. Mrs. Guzman has decades of experience working with, supporting, and founding small businesses, which she has prepared to lead the SBA during this moment. Most recently, Mrs. Guzman was the State of California's Director of the Office of Small Business Advocate, where she oversaw implementation of the state COVID-19 relief grant program. Mrs. Guzman also helped lead SBA during the Obama administration, serving as the Deputy Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor for 3 years from 2014 through 2017. During her nomination hearing last month, Mrs. Guzman demonstrated her commitment to ensuring the SBA relief programs, as well as its traditional loan programs are implemented equitably, and they will help small businesses in Black, Latino, Native, rural, and other underserved communities overcome the historic barriers they face. She is committed to ensuring the agency has the right systems, technology, and operating procedures in place to advance the mission and reach all of our small businesses. And she's committed to ensure funds get into the hands of small businesses who have been hurt the most by the pandemic and the economic crisis through no fault of their own. Mr. President, as we learned during the pandemic, SBA has a key role to play in our nation's effort to fight systems of inequality that prevent many entrepreneurs in underserved and underbanked communities from starting and growing successful businesses. Mrs. Guzman will be an advocate for small businesses in these communities within the administration, and she will be a strong partner to us in Congress as we build federal capacity to support small businesses through the coming economic recovery. Mrs. Guzman's commitment to equity and her deep knowledge of the needs of small businesses and the best policies to help them are why she received bipartisan praise during her nomination hearing and was advanced by the committee by a bipartisan vote. Mrs. Guzman has earned broad support from the small business community. Her nomination has been endorsed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, U.S. Hispanic Chamber, the U.S. Black Chamber, the National Small Business Association, the Small Business Majority, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, and many other small business advocacy groups. SBA needs an administrator who can hit the ground running, and I'm confident Mrs. Guzman is exactly the right person for the job. I urge my colleagues who have spoken with small business owners who still need support from the SBA, and I'm sure everyone has, to join me and vote to confirm Mrs. Guzman as the SBA administrator. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 26, Isabella Guzman of California, to be Administrator of the Small Business Administration, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Isabella Guzman of California to be Administrator of the Small Business Administration shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Cassidy, Durbin, Fisher, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Inhofe, Kane, Kelly, King, Lankford, Lujan, Markey, Menendez, Murkowski, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Rounds, Schatz, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Tillis, Warner, Warren, and Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Crapo, Haggerty, Kennedy, and Tuberville. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Daines, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Cotton, no. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Ms. Ernst, Ms. Ernst, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mrs. Capito, Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, no. Mrs. Hyde Smith. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer. Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto. Aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young. Aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran. Aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman. Aye.
The yeas are 80, the nays are 18. The motion is agreed to. Senator from Delaware.
Consent that all post-cloture time on the Guzman nomination be considered expired at 2:30 p.m. today.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have 6 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of both the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands at recess until 2:15.